Get the link. Boop. Wait, okay. Find this going good. Okay, let's wait, I don't need this to hello Priscilla. Okay, I know how to pronounce your name, but hello. Task manager, let's close that. Steve. What's up, Mike? Yeah, I did. Alright. Bro, chill, relax, man. Just play normally, and then do it. For once, nah. You should also done me. I know. I don't wanna beg. That's like begging. Okay, Steve. Just Steve. Oh wait, let me move this thing. Steve. I got cringe avatar. What's up? No, it's okay. Let me see. Where are you? Sure. Bro, move. Turn around. I don't care. Steve. That's pretty cool, I guess. Steve. Steve. 69, let's go. Just Steve. I like that a lot more. The avatar that you're using right now, that's a lot better. Steve. Yeah, it's very cool. This one is very cool. Steve. Bro, Steve yesterday joined my stream. Subto Steve. Subto Steve, or else I bite. It's up to me. Okay, just keep that. Just keep that. I don't have a problem. At this point, you sound like you want to get smited or nicked by him. No. I just want to take a screenshot with him. Bro, I thought so much of his friends are like, he's gonna blimp, blimp, blimp. But like, nothing happened. He gave me 1K and that's still crazy, but like, 10K, well, that's a lot, that's right. When the set list coming out, it's coming out in 5 hours. Steve, you could have got someone who gave you 1K. I don't want to beg him. Steve. A screenshot because no, a screenshot I couldn't because everyone was surrounding him. Steve. Let's go 100. Steve. Bro, like it's so annoying when people surround him. It's very annoying. Steve. Just Steve. No. I have a new profile pic now. It's kind of ugly and not ugly in the same time. I kind of like it. Steve. Wait. Up. So, just Steve. Guess destroyed by Steve. Wait, okay. Steve. Bro, what the hell? Bro. No. Steve. I mean, he can join early because today's no school. Steve. Bro, what's this guy doing? He just saw my stance spamming Steve. Steve. Just Steve. Imagine Steve like gives 1K when I hit 1K. Imagine he gives 2K when I hit 2K, 3K in the air like that. But that won't happen already. No. Okay, Steve. Steve. Ah. Bro, my tooth is sorting. What the hell? Okay, I don't care about that. Steve. Am I muted? Okay, I'm not. Steve. Hurts. Steve. Oh no, that didn't count. What's a vacuum? What's a vacuum? Steve. Is that Valkyrie? Is that Violet Valkyrie? What's Valkyrie? Okay. Steve. The Ice Valk? The Ice Valk, you mean? Steve. Damn. Oh, with glasses? With glasses? Steve. Search catalog. Steve. No. Steve. Yo. You will have nightmares because of me saying Steve. Oh go. Steve. Juststeve. You should also do it to like maybe BVOJ, maybe to Steve, maybe to Mike, maybe do it. Mike said he will blimp. It is worth it, bro. My throat is not even hurting. You're probably like 14 or something, and I'm like 12, and it's not hurting, so like it won't even matter to me. Steve. Like look, I'm already at 14 minutes and I'm already at 540. So no, that's way too much math. No, I don't want to do it. Steve. No, wait. I'm gonna wear a shirt, a very cool shirt that I made yesterday before I was going to sleep. Let me wear it. Where? Steve. Do ba do ba do boo 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 boo. Do ba do ba do. Yeah, so like 2.5k, 2.5, no, 2.5k. Yeah, look at my shirt. Steve. 4 hours? That's fine, bro. That's fine. Steve. I mean, I can stream for that long. I don't care. Nothing. Just him joining. I think so. Maybe blimping. I don't know. His friend told. His friends told. Or maybe I don't know. Not completely confirmed that he'll blimp. Oh wait, this Cody guy is from Zero Box stream. Steve. Oh, Jojo, what's up? What's up, Jojo? It's almost 10. I'm UK. Steve. Bro, Jojo, I miss you. I miss you streaming, bro. I miss you streaming. Steve. Wait, what? He's doing it again. Yes. Steve. No, I'm not giving up. We're gonna stream today, let's go. Stream with me. Together. Stream Steve. Only did because I know. Yeah, last time I joined your stream, you were sick. Steve. 700. Okay, Steve. You want some monies, Jojo? Steve. What they doing? Monies? Damn. Steve. Why again? I don't know. I'm bored. I don't want to do a racing stream because that's so boring. Like, it's very boring. Like, people don't enjoy watching it. Like, people, like when I get tortured. Like, when I jump on Legos, when I do, like, random stuff. They like it. Steve, it's funny. Steve. Bro, that plushie is so cool. I'ma buy it. Steve. Steve. Yes, Steve. Just Steve. I have a free button. You can buy Among Us. You can buy my Among Us. Steve. Steve. Yeah, Among Us. Steve. Thank you so much for a free rubber duck. 6K. Damn, that looks clean. Steve. Bro, I wanna blimp someone. I wanna get blimped, and then I don't know, 10K in the last 3 days. Damn. Steve. Steve. Yes, I give my friends 3.5K. Cool. Steve. Bro, look at Giorgio. Like, what the hell? He has so much money. Like, what? Steve. Steve. Bro, my. What the hell? Steve. I'm probably gonna buy over 10. Oh! Steve. Ooh, let's go on one more, Steve, and then we go 1K. Steve, let's go 1K. 1K. Just gotta do that like 10 more times. Steve. Bro, what? Really? Did I? No, I said Steve. No. Steve. No, Rob, will you get the sound 100% the dog matter? Steve. Bro, there's a streamer that will get nuked and he will be like blimping like so much people. He'll be blimping a lot of people. Steve. Yeah. Devin's gained like 3K in 1 week. I swear when I was watching him, bro, so much people were watching him. Like 60 people were watching him. Donating. Steve. Bro, is it even cheating? Cheat a bit, bro. Yeah. If I won't get blamed this stream, I must say Jojo or Steve or Robert Duck 10k times tomorrow. If I won't get blamed this stream. My goal is to get blamed. I just want to get blamed one time. Bro. Second. Deep, deep, body, boop, 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 boop. Steve. Oh, my finger. Steve. Steve. See y'all. See ya, Cody. Steve. Let me see what they're doing here. Steve. No, what did I do? Steve. Guys, come dance with me here. Come dance with me near me. Steve. Yes, sir. Steve. Wait, I'ma get Bobak. Bro, he is getting Robux like every second. He's a rich guy. Steve. Should I do a stream saying Jojo like 10k times? That'll be fun. Steve. Bro, I can do like, if I get a good, like for example, if I get like an A, I get 100 pounds. And like, if a star, 200 pounds. So like, yeah. Steve. Really? Can you say LeBron James? LeBron James? There you go. Steve. LeBron James. Steve. Oh, bro, rubber's going now. No. Now everyone will leave. Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Everyone buy this shirt and wear it with me. Everyone buy the shirt that I'm wearing right now and wear it with me. Everyone buy this shirt that I'm wearing right now and wear it with me. Steve, 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 Steve. Wait, 1.5K in 30 minutes. 30 minutes plus 30 minutes makes 1 hour. 1050 plus 1050 makes 3000. So 3000. So like 3.5 hours maybe. Yeah, I'm gonna eating a donut until Steve joins. Steve, 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 Steve. Bro, I should make a streaming until Steve joins. Steve, 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 Steve. I know he's gonna torture me. Like he's gonna join in like 5 hours or something. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Bro, wait, let me go get a kiss. It's a candy. It's very tasty. I'm back. Steve. Yo, thank you, Georgia, for the 5. Steve. Well, let me open this one. Thank you so much for the 5. Thank you so much again for the 5. Thank you. Thank you so much again for the 5. Steve. Let's go. Steve. Georgia, where the... Thank you again. Where the... I love Steve again with me. Steve. Bro, Steve Blim 0. Bro, again. Thank you again. Steve. Thank you so much again, bro. Steve. Bro, Zero Bug is getting the headless. Bro, so lucky. Steve. Steve. Let me check who's streaming right now. I know Zero is streaming. He's probably screaming right now.
Can I get my roblox to load though? It's not. I'm actually hallucinating. Bro, I'm hallucinating. I'm hallucinating. I'm hallucinating. Bro, I'm hallucinating. I'm actually hallucinating. I'm clipping everything. I'm clipping everything. Nah. I'm hallucinating. I can't. Thank you so much. No.
That's a kinda bad reaction, I'm not gonna lie. Steve. Jojo, wear the I Love Steve with me. The shirt I'm wearing right now. Steve. Did I get donated? Oh, thank you again, Mike. Thank you so much again. Jojo, thank you so much again. Steve. Yes, sir. Let's go. Come here. Come here with me. Come here. Steve. Skill issue. He wear the skill issue. Bro, I'm gonna upgrade it. It looks mad ugly, bro. Steve. Oh, Steve. Bro, did you read the behind what I put on it? It's Bozo. It's written there, Bozo. Steve. Bro. Steve. I think so. Steve is gonna join. I think so. He will, because he's legit in so much people stream right now. He's probably doing donation madness right now. Steve. Bro, Zero got the headless. He got the headless. He's so lucky. Steve. Wait. Bro. Robert Duck is getting angry at me because I'm saying Steve so much. Bro, should I do is sing Steve for 1 million times? Should I do it? Because everyone is telling me I should do it in Discord. Should I do it? No, don't. Steve. Maybe I should do like part 2, part 3. Yeah, I guess. Try to jumping on Legos non-stop on stream. Because I jumped on Legos like 50 times yesterday. Steve. Bro, don't you see I'm busy saying Steve? Don't type your names, I ain't gonna gift, I'm broke. Steve. Steve. Yo, if some is wait, I'm gonna donate the whole server. Let's donate the whole server. Bro, no, it's way too much. For Georgia, okay, I will do it. I will do it for Georgia. We'll do it for Georgia. Bro, I own like almost everything from Mike. Mike, make some more, because I own like almost everything from yours. Steve. Yo, bro, what the hell? What should I do? Wait. Say your name 200 times. Georgia. Okay, let's go. Georgia. I swear, if Steve joins right now, I'll pass out and I'll dump a whole Lego canvas I have right now right next to my legs. I'll dump it on my head if Steve is in the stream. Steve, oh no, Georgia. Bro, this vid just 461. I mean, she or he, I know, they're getting blind like every day. Georgia. Donate to me, idol. Jojo, did you hear that? But you're his idol. You're his idol, Jojo. Done. Steve. Steve, let's go. 2K. Let's go. Steve. Mike, make some more game passes. What the hell? How did he raise 11K and donate to 0? Who gave him Roblox? Georgia. Oh no, not Georgia. I'm finished. Bro, why this thing? Steve. pooped myself. Stevie! Stevie! Steve! My heart, my heart, my heart, my heart, my heart. Steve! Steve! I love you! Bro! Let's go! Let's go! He joined! He joined me! He joined me! He joined me! My parents are sleeping. I cannot shout. Bro! 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 My parents are sleeping. I cannot shout. Bro! 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 Bro, where is he? George! Yes! Stevie! Stevie! Steve! I love you, bro! Look at my shirt. Look at my shirt. Look at my shirt. Do you like it? Oh my god! Oh my god! Oh my god! I just get blimped. I never get blimped. I never got blimped. I never got blimped. What the? What the hell? 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 Steve, 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 I swear to God, you're the best man alive. On God right now, bro. I love you more than my brother. Steve, I love you. Bro, bro, where's the blimp? Blimp, 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 blimp. I never been blimped. I never been blimped. I never been blimped. I never been blimped. Look at that, Steve also. Bro. I got blimped. What the? Bro. I love you. Bro, Steve. Steve. You can't understand how big of a fan am I. Bro, Steve, I've been blimped. I got blimped. I got blimped. I got blimped. I got blimped. I never been 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 blimped. Bro, he donated me. Dang. What the hell is going on? I got blimped. Okay, let's go back to sing. Steve, bro, I love you. I love you. I love you. Steve, 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 Steve. I got blimped. Joking. Bro. Yeah. I love you, Steve. Let's go. I never been blimped. I never been blimped. I never been blimped. I never been blimped. Steve, 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 Steve. Bro, I still can't believe I got blimped. 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 I cannot breathe. Steve. I love you. I love you so much. Bro. I got 9K pending. 9K pending. What the hell? Steve, 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 Steve. Yes, 9K. 9K. I got 9K pending. Steve, 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 Steve. Oh my god, what the... Bro! Bro! I got 10k pending. I think I'm gonna pass out. I'm dying. I swear I'm dying. I'm dying. I'm dying. Yes, sir. Let's go. W. Let's go. Let's go. Let's go. Now Mike is not depressed. Now Mike is not depressed. Take a screenshot. Take a screenshot. Bro, 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 bro. Oh, bro. This is nothing compared to you, Jojo, but like, there you go. Steve, yeah, I mean, Mike, can you make like more? I love Steve, I love Steve, I love Steve, I love Steve, I love Steve. Steve. Top donor of the stream, Steve, 10k. $10k. Got blimped. Steve. Bro! I'm gonna cry. Wait, what? Wait, Jojo, what did you say? Wait, let me put this. You need to drink. Oh, yeah! Wait, I'm gonna tell Steve to join. Yeah, I forgot. Bro, no, I want Steve to join first. Yeah, I'm telling the whole Discord server. He's all Discord server and needs mods. Bro, I need to drink toothpaste with water. Bro, is Steve here? Is Steve here? Because I need to drink toothpaste with water. Because he let me see your cam. Is Steve here? Can you tell Steve to join because I need to drink toothpaste with water. Bro, I'm so rich now. I never had 10k pending. Bro, I gotta wait because he's way too busy. He's such a busy guy. If you join like my stream, I'm straight doing it. Steve. Oh! Hello. Shelby, hello. Bro, that looks sick. Hello. I have that, I think. Buy my shirt. Buy my shirt. Look at this. Steve fans, let's go. Bro, so much dark matter boot. 10k booths. Let me turn off anonymous. What the hell? You donated so much. Okay, let's go back to saying Steve. Steve. Well, I'm gonna donate the whole server. I unlock every small of. Bro, what? I'm gonna donate him. Where's shop to Juststeve stand? Free donates of those course. Tender him. I actually got blinked. Steve. Bye, Shelby. Thank you for coming in. Should I kick? No. Okay. Bro. Oh, this guy is begging. Steve. were you begging? Yeah, see? Steve, don't beg. Don't beg. Not my problem. Steve. Bro, Mike legit told you, do not beg. Bro, this guy's crying because I kicked him. Steve. Mike, can you time this guy out? Steve. Mike, can you please time this guy out? Steve. Yeah, thank you. Steve. If he like says I didn't beg again, just hide him from the channel because that's annoying. Steve. Like Beggar's grammar is so bad. It's like please call me. Donate, please. Donate my please. My dad is at the hospital. Please, I need Robux to so he can have a surgery. Please donate. That's how beggars act. Steve. Wait, really? Should I unban him? What was his name? I'm not unbanning. I think so. That's it. Steve. I unbound him. Steve. Bro, this guy looks like Project Supreme's old. Steve. Wait, Firecracker, can you try to join again? If that doesn't work, tell me your username. Steve. Wait. I think so, that's it. Steve. Wait, let me go check Discord. Steve. Try to join. Firecracker, try to join. Steve. Oh wait, okay. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Wait, what happened? I can't join. What's your Roblox username? I'm still banned. Bro, why did I do it? Okay, I understood that you didn't beg. I know, I understood. We got blamed. This hot dog got blamed. Bro, he legit donuts like everyone. To everyone. Steve. Bro, Hazem is getting so much Robux today. Steve. Wait, let's go to Steve. Wait, I'm gonna tell $0 to rate me. Cause, yeah. Wait, what?
Wait, why am I barking? I'm not, I show speed. Ooh boo.
Hey, yo! Bro.
Cause you didn't know that? Alright, oh yeah. It wouldn't. It shouldn't. I might totally. Why do I have to say Ubu 2k times? I might flip.
Okay, it's in Uber. Okay. Bro, he blipped the same guy again? No. Say what? Say Uber? You mean Uber? Bro, what do you mean the tags? Say dad 100 times. Steve. Why? No, I'm busy saying Steve. Like, are you in Steve's server? Like his Discord server? Steve. Bro, you should definitely join. They're doing like events, a lot of stuff. They're doing events so much. So, what do you... Bro, I want to tell Uvo. See dad milk 100 times? Nah. Steve. Bro, Steve has like millions, I'm not joking, because I saw his like one video and he legit blurred how much Robux he has. And that's possible, and it was like small amount. So that means like it's millions, because he would show if he has less Robux. he would show, but when he has like so much, Steve. I don't know why he blurred it. Bro, we're so close to 52k. Steve. Discord. Steve. Bro, let me go check my pending Bobox. Bro, Mike, you gotta stream also. If you want Bobox, go stream. Please donate. You gotta stream it. Maybe there's something like maybe not, maybe yeah, who knows? I don't know. Damn, 10k, it looks clean. Sheesh, Jesus Christ, bro. Damn. Steve. Maybe you don't need to stream in like Twitch because there's no like a lot of people that play Please Don't in Twitch. Just like YT streams. Steve. Wait, I'm gonna show him. Steve. Bro. Steve. Wait, be right back. I'm gonna get some candy and some water. Be right back. I'm back. lot of people in Discord. Steve. Steve. Wait, bro, I remember this epic channel, bro. When I was doing Pepsi Mix, like Pepsi Mix, video, YT streams, he would join. I gave him free pets. I remember. Steve. Wait, I'm gonna ask Zero Boxer, rate me, boy. Rate me, baby boy.
Here we go. Let's go. Alright, just to prove, there is water in there. Lots of water. It's a full bottle. 3, 2, 1.
Okay. Ugh. Oh.
Ugh. Done. Ugh. Jesus. Oh my god, that took forever. Oh my god. Ugh. Oh. Finally, 2k Ubus, Jesus. Oh my god. Oh. Alright. Alright. Peace, boys. I need a toilet now.
Okay. He's okay. Zero is. Show us your setup. No. Why? There's so much stuff. There's food. I mean, it's kind of clean, but the cable management is bad. But I don't care about that. Steve. Bro, it doesn't work. I don't know why. Okay. Steve. Break it. Let's go. Bro, I don't know what to do. Steve. Bro, I gotta move like a bit. Let me run around the map. I know. Steve, 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 Steve. Oh wait, he's back. Guess what? Guess what? Government. Yes, sir. Disco. Who are you from Steve Discord? Let me set this down real quick. Yo, thank you so much. Oh, Steve is W. Steve is W. Okay. Hi. Alright. Steve is the GOAT. Yo, thank you. Thank you so much for your 5. Okay, let's go back to St. Steve. Steve. Thank you for staying in the stream. Steve. We don't talk about the sun. Steve. Oh my god. Yeah. Steve. Thank you. Yo, thank you so much for the first. Yo, bro, thank you so much. I like your mouse pad. Yo, zero bug. Yo! Zero bug? What the hell? Zero bug joined my stream. What the hell? Let's go! Steve. Bro, Zero bug is in my stream. What the hell? What is going on? Steve. Zero, I can make you a thumbnail, by the way. I can make you one. It's pretty easy. And Photopedia is very easy to make thumbnails. Steve. Bro, no way Zero Bug joined my stream, bro. What the hell? Steve. Wait, is the link working? Is the link working? I'm gonna regenerate the link. Because I don't think so the link is working. Yes, sir. I'm not 3K. Yeah, I'm not 3K. Bro, imagine he joins. Bro, by the way, congrats on the 21K that Steve gave you. Steve gave me 10K and 69 Robux. I ate my mic when that happened. Steve. Bro, I'm gonna donate so much more, bro. This is so less. Gotta donate more. I'm getting donated like in every second. Steve. I don't think I can. Only 10K pending, but it's 49K. Steve. Should I say Zero Bug like 10K times? Should I do it? Steve. A YouTuber called Mike. He said if you say my name 10K times, I'll blimp you. But he like needs to get 10K Robux. Should I? Yeah. I will. Zero Bug. This is by the way, Zero. This is like this is already second time of me saying Steve 10K times. Yesterday I also said 10K. I also said just Steve 10K times, and today I'm saying get one more. Steve. Wait, Zero, should I jump on Legos for you? Should I jump on Legos for you? Should I jump on Legos for Zero Bug? Should I jump? Okay, bet, bro. Let me get the Lego out that I was jumping on yesterday. Let's go. I'm gonna try to lick my face. Is it C? 0, 0, 0. Should I do it from the chair? Should I jump from the chair or just from chair or not? Chair? Should I do from chair? Chair. Bro, back. Wait. Okay, I'm jumping. One, two. Wait, I'm swinging. 1, 2, 3. Oh, ow, ow, ow. Oh, ow, ow. 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 Oh, my legs. Ow. I'm gonna keep the liquid free. Oh, my legs. My legs. Ah, yes, it does. My legs. Oh, my legs. Steve. Oh, whoa. That hurt, bro. Oh. Bro, I think so my legs will be bleeding in like 3 days. Because I'm jumping on Legos so much. I jumped yesterday on Legos like 7 times already. And today I jumped like 2 times. I think that they will be bleeding. I don't know. Steve. Ah, bro, that one hurts so much. Bro, that one hurts so much. Zero, should I jump for a clip? Should I jump from the chair for a clip? Should I jump from the chair for a clip? Steve. Say yes if I should jump for a clip. Steve. Welcome back, God 12 Nick. Steve. Please don't. Should I jump for a clip? For a clip? Come on, for a clip. Should I do it? For a clip? Should I? Say yes if I should. Say no if I don't need to. Steve. I'm going to upload the vid. Wait, Zero. Should I make a thumbnail for you? Should I make a thumbnail for you right now? Should I make a thumbnail? Are you uploading the getting blimped? Because I can make you a thumbnail after this stream. Steve, 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 Steve. Oh, zero bug already left. Steve, 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 Steve. I'll go check Discord. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve.
Oh yeah.
Steve, 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 Steve,
Oh
Steve,
yeah.
Steve, 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 Steve. Thank you for your sub. Steve, 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 Steve. Thank you for your sub. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Bro, it's no time to ask truth or dare. Steve, 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 Steve. Okay. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Oh my god, Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Oh damn. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. What the hell is that thing? That looks mad, bro. That looks mad. Dun, 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 dun. Well, let me do one thing. Let me do one thing. Okay, let's get back to Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. It's okay, I see it. Steve. Oh, let's go, let's go. Steve, 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 Steve. Problem. Wait, there's a guy asking for my stream. Bro, there's like, wait. Oh wait, what's up, Keegan? What's up? What's up? What's up? Are you popular? Let me go check you out. Keegan. Keegan, what? Oh wait, he has 2k subs, almost 2k subs. What the hell? How much does he have raised? Let's see, let's see, let's see. $60k. Nice. Sick. Steve. Wait. I'm gonna go to his stream and let me see. Keegan's. Keegan starts. Wait, what the hell? Saying he hasn't, or saying he hasn't said. It took you 4 hours. What do you mean?
The elevator. Bo never goes outside.
What do you mean? It took you 4 hours. In 4 hours. It took you like 6,000 or something. What? How? Steve. Nah, I won't give him the video there. Should I give him the video? Wait, who's this guy? Who's this guy from Discord? What the hell? Alex. Huh? Okay, I'm not. What the hell? Who's that guy? Steve. Look at that, bro. Look at that, bro. 11K. Damn. Oh, damn, bro. 11K. 11K. $11K, what the hell? Breathe air. Steve. Oh, almost 5K, come on. Steve. Let me drink some water. Steve. 50 more to go to you 5K. Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Let's go 5K. Go 5K. Steve, 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 Steve. Yes, halfway. Vixie, are you scamming? By the way, when I joined you, you were like donate, and I stopped being AFK, and I donate you, and I saw someone donate you, and you're AFK. Is that scamming? Steve, 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 Steve. Oh wait, what? This works? Bro, do you know that you're legit on YT right now? Steve, 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 Steve. So you're a scammer. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. So you're scamming. It was like 5 people that donated you, and you were FK. So that's like they're just scamming. Bro, stop acting innocent. I know you scammed. Just tell the truth. You scammed, yeah? Steve, 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 Is Steve joining? No, gotta wait. Okay, I'll wait. Steve. Type faster, bro. Oh yeah. Okay. Bye. Bro, stop acting innocent. I know you scammed. Should I go join him and see if he's scamming? Where's the 10k pending? Oh, nice. Let's go. I got 10k pending. What was I doing? Steve. Chicken. Okay. Wait, what? Okay, cool. Steve. What's up, Mike? I go. Oh, wait. You know. You already know. Steve. Mike, do you know like a guy named Vixie? Have you ever met him? Have you ever met that guy? Steve. I need 18 more roblox to 52. Okay. What's up, Mike? Steve. Wait, let's check. Let's go check our balance. Our roblox. Okay, let's go. Right now we go 4. Okay, we go 4. Okay. How much money do we have? 10k and 25 robux. Cool. So cool. Gotta stop talking and just say Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Drink some water. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Wait, what? Oh. Let's go back to sing Steve, 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 Steve. This stream is kind of dead today. It's kind of dead. It's kind of dead. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. A 6 year. No. Steve, 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 Steve. Oh, bro. Steve, 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 Steve. Oh my God, my fingers. I'm gonna rest a bit, bro. I'm so tired. All is pending, everything is pending. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. I drink some water. Be right back, I'm gonna go get some candy. I'm back. Let's go. Alright, when we got to this guy's channel, I swear, so if he steals my content, bro. No way, is there a stream?
Trade it with a unique brother.
Steve. Oh, Steve.
On this, okay? I need you guys all to like get on this, okay? Don't go like, oh, it's fake. Actually, like, be with the troll, okay? Be actually with the troll. Like, go like, oh my god, in chat.
Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve.
Wait, Steve, I'm gonna donate to you, okay? Steve, I'm gonna nuke you as well. Let's nuke Steve, guys. Let's nuke Steve. Oh my god! Oh my god! Yo, there's a smite! There's a smite, bro! No way! No way! Oh my god, guys!
Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. What's up? I'm doing one thing real quick. Wait 1 second. Bro. Okay, let's go back to St. Steve. Steve. Oh, Steve. Oh, wait, I have the chance. Oh. Wait.
Right, for some reason I can't. Hello? Smite, please. I got you, Steve, because I'm just like, yeah. Okay, wait, yeah, okay. Oh my god! The smite! Yes, go! 10 likes already, boys! We got 10 likes already. Guys, we got 10 likes already. Dub. Yo, Steve gave me 69 for 20. Real? Yo, look at the smite, bro. Look at my smite. Bro, I need everyone to like the video right now, okay? Otherwise you stink of poo, and yes, and you're banned from Roblox forever, and you love Slenders if you don't like the video. So yes. If you like the video, then you hate Slenders. Stop, man, let's go. Let's go, bro. Let's go, Steve. Let's go. Steve, can you give me like 10 quadrillion Robux real quick? That's nothing, right? That's nothing.
Wait, what?
Steve can give me 1 quadrillion Robux.
What's this? Should I go back to St. Steve? Okay, I'm gonna go back to St. Steve. Yo, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you for 5 Robux. Steve. Yo, thank you. Thank you so much. Steve. I'm legit broke, so I can't. I gotta wait for my 10k to pen, and I'll do 1k giveaway, maybe like someone says, like the Seek, I know, that kind of stuff. Steve. Steve. Bro, this guy's outfit looks sick, bro. Steve. Damn, Violet Vog, core blocks. Damn. Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Is my chat broken? Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Oh wait, he wants to add me? Okay. Zig. Steve, 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 Steve. Watch Ozzy nuke somebody. Watch him do it. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. I'm gonna drink toothpaste with water soon because I got blamed by Steve today. I'm gonna do it. Oh wait, why did I stop at 666? Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Wait, I gotta do one thing. I gotta tell.
I got you, bro. I'll give you 100k and 100,000, bro. There you go. Enjoy, my friend. Actually, no, that's a mil. There you go. Gift.
Okay. He's still doing something. I go here. Steve, 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 Steve. Yo, show you're donated. Show you're donated. Is Ozzy blimping everyone? Is he blimping everyone on the server? Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Bro, I wanna rest a little bit. Hey, don't listen more than 1,000. Okay, let me go to his right team. Let me go to his right team. Okay, 53 subs. Cool. Damn! 1K views? Oh, wait. This guy steals you. Bitch. Okay. Wait, let me go to zero stream. I gotta tell Steve something.
Doing this, bro. I feel bad for you guys. Yo, I need everyone to join the Discord server for a real blimp, you know? A real blimp. Like, definitely not fake money, but like a real blimp. My PC keeps shutting down. This is annoying. Oh, Steve's PC keeps getting shut down, bro. L. That's a rip, bro. That's an L and a rip. I joined Discord server. Yo, thank you, bro. I'll give you 10,000 Robux in imaginary money. Stranger Things, my shot goal is 1,000. Got you. Imagine 69420, don't know. Oh, yeah, that'll be sick. Wait. Do I even have a 69? I have a 69421, not 69420. Yeah, look. I have a 69421. Cool. Alright, should we host the Simon Says? Wait, Roblox content creators. Sure, I'll join Steve. What's this? What the flip is this? I want to show you something on Discord. Alright, bet. Hi. Oh, flip. Steve gave someone 69420. Damn. I just had a look in the Discord server. Damn. I remember this. Nice. Video used to be 40k, 70k. Damn, nice. This is a creator server. Cool. Nice, I'm in the creator server. Cool.
Bro. Do you have the screen? Yeah.
Cool. Guys, you guys want to do a fashion show? Double L. Should we do a fashion show? Ayo, do you guys want a fashion show? Double L. Who wants a fashion show? Wait, what is this server, Steve? Is it literally just like a creator server? Make the 6942021 make the 694.
Bro. Oh, Steve! I'm doing it. Okay. You here? Is Steve here? Do it. Okay. Wait. Brought back. I very quick. Steve? Where's Steve? Bro, where's Steve? Where's Steve? Bro, where's Steve? Steve. I know you're from someone who done it your life. Bro, where's Steve? Bro, where's Steve?
It's getting like 100 views a minute. What the hell? It's gaining 10 views every like 5 seconds. What the flip, boys? What the flip is happening? What the flipperoos is happening, bro? Oh, it sounds so cringe, man. People say what? It will go on sale sometime between the 1st to the 4th. Is that actually? So we have to wait? Oh, God's
Where's
sake.
Steve?
We have to wait so long, man. How many members am I out in my Discord? I don't know. Hopefully the first. Yeah, hopefully it comes out. Hopefully it comes out today. Join for a blimp in imaginary Roblox. Lol. Let me just react to the video. You can't even buy it yet? Yeah. I can't even buy it yet because my pending hasn't come through. I don't know why, because, yeah. I hate how it takes like 4 to 5 days to come through. It's actually so annoying. It's actually kind of annoying, I can't lie. It's kind of a cringe moment.
Bro, I'm waiting.
15 YouTube videos go, man. Mine has 3.6k views. Yeah,
Steve?
bro, Steve, mine's on like 236 views in 20 minutes. What the flip? What the flipperoo? Imagine you for real getting nuked though. Bro, I'll go mental if I get nuked. Yeah, that would be actually sick. Literally, I go like, oh, I die. I literally die halfway through the stream. I think if I got nuked, I'll probably get passed out. I'll probably pass out. Make a video of getting smited 10 times. Please donate.
Wait, is Steve joining?
That would be funny. What the fit was that laugh?
Steve joined. Oh
Okay,
my
no, that
God,
just
what
sounds
the
weird
hell?
now.
Okay,
And nuke, yeah, guys. If you join the Amazon gift card giveaway for a free nuke. I'm joking. There's no, yeah. Guys, join the server because it's dead right now. Just vibe with me till we wait for Headless, and we're talking with Juststeve right now. So yes, imagine you get smited. I would literally jump off a cliff if I got smited. To be honest, I'm joking. I wouldn't. Don't please, no one smite me. Don't want to die.
Oh my
I'll donate
gosh.
after. I'm gonna donate after. In a bit.
Steve.
Does the new come with launch codes? Or do you, what the? There we go. We get some more people in. There's new flip. Oh, flip. Oh my god! I almost just dropped my phone. Jesus Christ, that was so close. You're gaining so much subs today. I don't, wait. What the flip? Why are we?
Here.
How many subs are we at? 7.32k subs. Dub chat. If we can get 8k by the end of this year, I will. I don't know what I would do. I'll give one person 1k. Yo, Bacon, thank you for the 5, bro. I appreciate that so much, my guy. Yeah, we're gonna just be chilling till Headless comes out, to be honest. We've been chilling. Can't lie, we've been chilling. Bro, Steve is at 311 views. It was literally on like 236. It's actually doing quite good.
Steve join. Steve join. Steve join.
Doesn't it?
Wait, I'm waiting for. Oh wait, it's the guy.
Wait, Steve, are you still in the VC? Hello? Yeah, Steve's still in the VC, dub.
Oh, bro. Wait, what? Where's Steve? Just Steve.
Steve, what did Matt send me, bro? What the hell was this? Roblox was online 17 hours ago. Is it actually? Bro, we're literally just waiting for Roblox to like publish Headless Head, to be honest, bro. I can't know. Oh my god, it actually was! Roblox was online 18 hours ago. Hey, yo, what? DMs are alright. Oh, that's actually a cold FIFA cover, I can't lie. What the flip is this? Okay. Steve, that's questionable. That's very questionable. Hanging. Oh, Matt, I would not have that, bro. That's a violation. Steve, put it in the Discord. Put it in the Discord. That's a violation. I can't lie, bro.
Bro.
Matt, he called you a maid, bro.
Oh, where is she? Where is she? Where is she? Bro, where is she? Wait, what? Oh, he's here. Oh. Oh, he's there. What's good? Hello. Bro, I'm waiting. wait, Jake, mate. Can you spam, in Zero's chat that Steve joined, Frozy is drinking toothpaste with water because I got blimped. Say that in his chat, please, if you can. Oh, bro. Where is... join in. Bro, why isn't he joining? Bro, come on. Hello. Yo, hello. What's up? Bro, Juststeve needs to join right now because I'm drinking toothpaste with water because I got blimped. Roblox went online. Imagine the case. Yeah, I know they one's online. Bro, where's this guy, bro? Where's he? Oh.
Bro, it's on 44 likes, man. Your video's on 44.
Come on.
Bum, 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 bum.
And currently right now you don't, but you will have enough for heaven.
Yeah. Yeah, right now I don't, but yes, I will. Yes, I will. I will.
So you just sell your face.
Yeah, but it take forever. It will take forever.
Don't take forever, they be
Oh.
selling fast.
What, Bubble Trouble?
Bubble trouble.
No, wait.
Ready?
He must be...
Yeah. I want to show you the value of it at the start of the year.
Alright, boys, give me a minute. I'm just gonna reset server. It's a bit laggy. Hold on. Give me a minute. It's a bit laggy. I don't know why it's laggy.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Always in July.
Thank you, B. Harbin, for the sub. I appreciate that. Alright, give me a minute. It's a bit laggy. Hold on. I need to get the link. Now I can't find the link.
10 minutes ago.
Let's see. Give me a minute. Give me a minute.
Bro. Steve legit joined my stream and then he left. I don't know why.
Give me a
Sold
minute.
2 hours ago.
Good.
Hello, Lord P. How you doing? Give me a minute. Let me do this. I can't find the link. Give me a minute. Keep saying give me a minute. I don't know why.
Keegan, oh my god.
Okay, I found the link. Yeah, we good. Oh yeah, let's copy and paste.
Bro. Where's Steve? I'm gonna go throw this shit away, bro. Be right back. I'm back. Bro. Yeah, I did get one today. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 just Steve, just Steve, just Steve, just Steve, just Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 69, 69, let's go. Wait, Steve is joining, I think so right now. I think so, he's joining right now. Bro, it looks disgusting. What do you mean yummy? Go spend it. Bro, 111 subs. Thank you so much, guys. Grinding. Oh, where's Steve? Steve. Where's Steve? Wait, what? Feels so good. I saw it, but you got scammed. Oh my god, where's Steve? Sixth. Sure. Okay. Okay. Watch. Oh wait, what? No! Bro, it's not 10k anymore. Bro, it looks ugly. Anyways, here. Bro, now it looks ugly. Sorry, I got offline, don't I? But I'm not streaming spooky. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 just Steve, just Steve, just Steve, just Steve, 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 hello, Steve. Steve, just Steve, just Steve, just Steve, 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 just 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 Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. I'll be right back. Okay, bye. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. What do you mean has him my way? Where? Where? Thank you, thank you. Steve, 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 just 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 Steve, 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 just Steve, just Steve, just Steve, just Steve, just Steve, just Steve, 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 just Steve, just Steve, just Steve, just Steve, just Steve, just Steve, 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 just Steve, just Steve, just Steve. What do you mean fake? Shut up. Just Steve, just Steve, just Steve, just Steve, just Steve. Am I donating? Steve, 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 Steve. Who said that? Who said that? Where's this kid? Where's this guy? Now what? Steve, 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 yo, what's up? Steve, 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 Steve. Hello, Goku. Okay. Steve, 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 Steve. Bro, what? Steve. All alone, I'll go, I'll go home.
Will you be posting a link? Oh yeah.
I'm finishing.
My bad, guys.
Finishing.
Before you pin the link, yeah, right? No begging or no AFKing.
No begging.
Put the link and get the link.
It's me. Oh yeah, Sauceless. What's good, man?
Donate 8, donate 8.
I'll send you a face right now.
Hey.
You don't even have my face.
You have your blood face.
Holy crap, man.
Let me continue singing Steve. What's up? Steve. Wait, let me tell. Him.
Already saw what people are doing. Make one for one Roblox real quick.
You don't even get Roblox intending.
What's good, blocks? Hey.
No, I'm good.
Bro, what's the point of having the legs? You're leaving it. Is it some type of clan requirement? With
No, their legs are good.
Where's Steve?
I actually like the legs.
Steve is, I think, so joining right now. Steve. Oh, what's up,
The legs
Shelby?
look clean.
Yeah,
I couldn't tell Steve to join on drinking toothpaste with water because he blipped me. What is going on?
Drippy. Is that sparkling? Bro, how to get that chain, bro? How to chain it? Ooh, damn, this looks sick. This looks sick. This looks far. Come on, bacon, brother. Me? Or Shelby? Spontaneous and Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Just do some good sounds. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Became Russian bacon. Skin a bone, all grand. Dun, 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 dun. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve. Oh my God, Steve, 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 Steve. Oh my God. Steve, 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 Steve,
Oh,
Steve, 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 Steve.
yeah.
Thank you for sub. Steve, 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 Steve. Go, let's go. Steve, 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 Steve. Skinner Bone, welcome home. Oh, bro. Steve, 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 Steve. I'm not done liking Steve, 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 Steve. Steve, 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 Steve.